question, Chad. That being said, I am going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker for today. But before I do that, I just want to thank everyone for coming out to attend our first presentation for a full month of Holocaust education and awareness events. And I want to take a moment to thank my fellow committee members who have all invested a great deal of time in this. They include Ms. Holly Marquez, Dr. Paul Nienkamp, Brian Gribbin, who is right here with us in the room today. Holly is actually in the virtual world with us today. We also have a lovely graduate student, Matt Lemunyon, who is helping us out. And we have a virtual online student, Chelsea Kiefer, who has done a lot of the work behind the scenes. In addition to that, we've had a great deal of support from Forsyth Library, including from Brittany Squire, who has filled in for Brian while he's been out just a little while. And of course, from Hays Public Library with Samantha Hill there. So I just want to take a minute to thank all of them for the time that they put into organizing this event and future events. However, without further ado, I do want to introduce Dr. Chad Gibbs. He is an assistant professor of Jewish studies and the director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston. Dr. Gibbs completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2021, and he is a historian of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, modern Germany, and war and society. His current project, which you're going to hear a little bit about here today, focuses on gender, geography, and social networks in Jewish resistance at Treblinka, which, as many of you know, was one of the 6 killing centers that the Nazis erected on Polish territory. Chad is quite prolific. He's held fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Yale University Fortunoff Video Archive, and the George Massa Program in History, as well as the USC Shoah Foundation, where he remains an affiliated researcher. He's worked extensively with oral histories, which you are going to see today in his presentation, as well as with archives that deal with Holocaust testimony. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chad. I'm going to go ahead and send it your way. And before we do that, I do want to instruct those who are in virtual space to direct your questions directly to Holly Marquez, and so that you're not sending them to Chad while he's trying to present.
Okay. Well, Professor Nickel, thanks so much for the invite to you and all of your colleagues that helped put this together. And thanks for that introduction. I'm really happy to share some of my work with you here today. So I'll just get started. On August 2nd, 1943, Jews trapped within the extermination camp Treblinka II rebelled against their SS and Travniki guards. According to their carefully designed and painstakingly concealed plan, conspirators were to gather stolen weapons from spaces predetermined throughout the camp and be ready for an attack signal. But shortly before most of those preparations were to take place, one of the most feared SS guards seized 2 prisoners and started marching them to an extermination site. Unwilling to allow the murder of those 2 comrades right before the hour of the revolt, someone took a shot at that guard. Others, unfortunately, believed that to be the appointed signal for the beginning of the revolt. Those shots effectively touched off the revolt about an hour early. While survivor accounts of those frantic moments vary greatly, all agree that the result of the early start was complete chaos. With many prisoners not yet armed or in their attack positions, the plan collapsed in that instant. But still, Treblinka burned and many prisoners managed to flee. What I just briefly sketched there is broadly familiar to most that have studied the Holocaust in one way or another. Less explored, though, are the roots of that uprising and how prisoners achieved that outcome. In my work, I use Treblinka survivor testimonies and those oral histories to uncover resistance acts of various kinds prior to the revolt and how prisoner social networks and spatial strategies, or how they got a hold of geography, made that uprising possible. Along the way, that exploration of prisoner efforts to create and safeguard what I call spaces of resistance has revealed the important and unexplored roles of Jewish women in resistance at Treblinka. So I'll focus on 3 such spaces of revolt in my talk today. In the first, I explain how the official camp infirmary and a storage building, when examined side by side, revealed prisoner actions to save lives and safeguard participants in the revolt. Following this, I'll discuss the camp kitchen and finally a barracks area near the gas chambers themselves that conspirators used to distribute and acquire weapons at or before the scheduled time of the uprising. Jewish women took part in resistance at all of those locations and many others. I've organized the work here today in such a way that you'll see the importance of their contributions rise as we move from one to the next, but at the same time, that level of historical recognition that they've received for those actions wanes as we move from one of these places to the next. The faltering awareness of Jewish women's roles in each of these locations links one of the main issues I want to highlight in this talk. Each of these spaces and our knowledge of them in the present has been profoundly impacted by gendered thinking. Gendered ideas not only helped keep the locations safe from the suspicion of guards, these ideas also work to conceal the very existence of women in Treblinka in both later testimonies by male survivors and succeeding historical texts. I conclude today with some discussion of how my findings regarding women's actions in resistance prompt consideration of archival silences and the gender dynamics of Holocaust survivor memory and storytelling in the oral history format. So returning to the day of the revolt, sources generally indicate that some 300 Jews managed to flee Treblinka in the midst of the frantic melee that followed that first shot. Historians have long believed that only 68 men and women who fled in those moments or escaped earlier managed to avoid recapture by Nazi forces and survive the remainder of the war. This number first emerged with the book that's on the screen here, the writing of Holocaust survivor, author, and publisher Alexander Donat. His 1979 book, The Death Camp Treblinka, a documentary, Donat included the names of Treblinka survivors and what information he could find for each of them. He stated that his list of survivors was, quote, anything but complete, unquote, but it's remained largely unchallenged these last 42 years. The museum at the site of Treblinka today uses Donat's work with the addition of some later recognitions for a total of 85 names. In the case of Treblinka, where almost no perpetrator documentation remains at all, really in contrary to how we normally think of the Holocaust as one of the best documented genocides that has ever taken place, here we only have survivor sources to go on because the Nazis themselves tried to destroy everything. Finding those survivor voices couldn't be more important. That's where we really get all of our leads to look at. So in the course of my research, I've identified so far 251 Treblinka survivors with a further 29 leads that I'm still working on. Some of those are language problems. Even as my own work, though, to find those survivors continues, I have to stress that this search was never going to be conclusive or complete. It's highly unlikely that we'll ever know exact number of people who escaped from Treblinka prior to the revolt, or even how many fled and evaded recapture after the uprising. It's possible that many survivors never chose to come forward or record a testimony of any kind of preferring to leave this episode in the past. This might particularly be true in regards to Jewish women at the camp, and we'll cover why in a little bit. In his interview held by the Fortunov Video Archive, though, Treblinka survivor Yaakov Eisner makes clear one of those reasons why women who are at the camp may not have come forward to tell their stories or even take part in the post-war justice process. Eisner states that when he was preparing to travel to Germany to testify at one of what was 2 Treblinka trials that took place there, he spoke with a woman who had been at the camp, and according to Eisner, this woman feared she would have to admit that she, quote, lived with a German, unquote, if she went to court. She didn't want this revealed because she was by then married and thought her husband might leave her if this came out. Eisner said he helped this unnamed woman secure 2 letters from doctors saying that she was too ill to travel for the trial. And Donat's list of Treblinka survivors includes 3 women. One is the mistakenly included name of Sonia Levkovich. She's mistakenly included twice, I'm sorry. Donat included her under both her birth name and her later married name. While it's possible that the woman that Eisner is talking about is one of the 2 that was identified by Donat in the process of his book, I don't think that's the case. Donat identified most of the survivors he named by searching the very records of those German trials. Both Branka Sukno and Sonia Levkovich did give evidence at those trials. Eisner's testimony indicates that this 3rd woman never went to Germany or recorded a pretrial statement. As things stand, Sukno and Levkovich remain the only 2 women specifically known to have been at Treblinka at the time of the revolt. My research has found 6 additional women who survived the camp, but none of them were in Treblinka at the time of the uprising or for a long enough period to experience life inside. This effectively makes researching the lives of Jewish women inside Treblinka something that you have to do in the voices of male survivors. It's a problem that makes how we parse the male voice even more important. Mr. Eisner's oral history highlights 2 of the reasons we know so little about the history of women prisoners at Treblinka and their participation in resistance and revolt. The first is their own understandable reluctance to relive those events, and the second is their later erasure by many of the male survivors they lived and fought alongside. In the same oral history interview recounting the story of this woman who was in the camp and didn't want to testify, Eisner also quite stunningly states that there were no women prisoners in Treblinka after he described the circumstances of the woman survivor he knew in post-war life. I believe Mr. Eisner's own unwillingness to talk about what happened to women in the camp explains his silence here and what looks like an attempt on his part, consciously or not, we could debate, to erase their history in the camp. That's a topic I'll again return to in depth after a description of the spatial history practices that have helped me kind of contradict and parse these statements by male survivors. But expanding from an initial interest in social networks of Jewish prisoners at Treblinka, my work to understand the organization of resistance must pay close attention to the spatial realities of prisoner life within the camp. By examining networks in tandem with geographies in a tightly and lethally controlled place like Treblinka, you can get a sense of which prisoner relationships, functioning like links in a chain to get you from one part of the camp to another, provided access to materials and spaces important to Jewish perseverance and later revolt. I've identified several of those spaces of resistance inside Treblinka, or locations with unique importance and meaning to prisoners. Members of the organizing committee, that is the group of inmates in charge of resistance planning, that's what they called themselves, carved out and protected these spaces to expand their combined access to the camp through efforts to control the perceptions, actions, or movements of German SS and Travniki guards. In my first example, prisoners wrested back a degree of control over life and death by finding means to limit German entrance into a structure called the Pferdestall. That's German for horse barn, a building that was also called Storage Barracks B. I'm not really sure if this is the way it still works, but can you see my cursor moving around on the map here?
Yes, we can.
You can? All right. So that building that I'm referring to right now is here labeled 26, this big long building next to the railroad tracks. That's the Pferdestall. That never actually functioned as a horse barn or a living accommodation. Its name comes from its design and its normal use in other camps. It looks like a horse barn. That's not what they used it for, though. At Treblinka, guards used that structure for storage of clothing that they had stolen from the dead. Control of this building and the infirmary enabled conspirators to both safeguard sick comrades and hasten the removal of distrusted informants. Women prisoners helped in both the elimination of those informants and as daytime message couriers between the Pferdestall and the main prisoner barracks. So that main prisoner barracks is this U-shaped building here and the Pferdestall over here. Some women were able to cross in between them during the daylight hours. Those two locations combined to form a single space of resistance. The Jewish prisoner Lagerälteste, or camp elder, a man named Alfred Golewski, secured permission of the SS to create an infirmary in the main housing barracks with allowance for 15 inmates to recuperate there at any one time. Golewski used his position as a man afforded some level of trust by the guards to convince the Germans that a system of recuperation, rather than just killing sick prisoners as they had long done, would lessen turnover in key roles and make the camp more efficient, something they were always looking to do. Neither side of that bargain, though, intended to use the infirmary as a place of healing. Seemingly from its inception, SS Guard August Mitte began sweeping the barracks infirmary for prisoners he considered too ill to return to work. Mitte routinely marched those he selected from the bunks set aside for the sick to a place of execution. The predictability of his actions made it possible for prisoners to not only protect those they wanted to save, but also to use him against their own internal enemies. Individuals that the resistance thought wanted gone could simply be left in the infirmary, some of them actually incapacitated because of injections given by Jewish doctors, while sick members of the prisoners' conspiracy were instead hidden under the clothing stored in the Pferdestall in this building here, and hidden there through the whole workday. Survivor Samuel Willenberg also points out how prisoners could even hasten the removal of an individual that they wanted gone from the sickbay by informing the SS of that person's condition and bringing about one of Mitte's sweeps through the infirmary barracks on their own schedule. Dr. Irena Irka Levkovsky was one of 4 prisoner doctors who may have helped drug informants so that they would appear ill enough for Mitte to select them on one of his rounds. Prisoners controlled the Pferdestall, the safety of the Pferdestall as an actual place of recuperation by leveraging German fears of lice and typhus, a preoccupation owed in no small part to Nazi propaganda labeling Jews as carriers of lice and vectors of typhus. Lagerälteste Golewski strengthened the protection of the space by using his position to constantly remind the guards that the clothing in the Pferdestall was infested, giving them a reason to avoid the building rather than patrol it as normal. I can't really resist the comparison to this action to a movie that maybe many of you have seen. By show of hands, I can see the classroom. How many of you have seen Schindler's List? A fair amount. Unfortunately, that number seems to be going down every year. But enough of you maybe for this moment here. In the movie, Itzhak Stern is held in Płaszów concentration camp, and Oskar Schindler comes to visit him at the gate. And Stern walks by guards scratching his head, and Schindler asks him why he's doing that, and Stern explains that making them think you have lice keeps them away from you. I can't say how historically accurate that scene is. We see him on this slide in this picture here actually veering away from him. But it is one of the first visuals that occurred to me when I was reading survivors talk about how they used German fears of lice to keep Germans away from them. I thought it was a pretty brilliant way of using their own propaganda against them. So several survivors speak of the Pferdestall and its use as a hiding place for the sick, as well as a space for resistance planning and covert communication during the daytime hours. In a statement given in 1961, Bronka Sukno explained that her job in the tailor shop gave her the ability to move freely between the Pferdestall and other areas. Moishe Kleinman, the supervisor of the tailor shop, confirms that and told of his own ability to move back and forth between those spaces as well. Interviewee Richard Glazar, who worked as a sorter in the Pferdestall, remembered Kleinman's visits to that building and his messages for those working there in his book. Glazar doesn't mention visits by Bronka Sukno. Tailors like Sukno and Kleinman needed access to clothes that were stored in the Pferdestall to gather materials for items they were being forced to make for German guards. That exploitation of the goods stolen from those killed in the gas chambers by guards was common at all 3 of the Aktion Reinhard camps. Saddening as it is, This provided Jewish prisoners with certain opportunities for resistance and survival, though. Treblinka survivor Eddie Weinstein successfully hid in the Ferdestall for as many as 17 days with a bullet wound in his arm inflicted by a Travniki guard on the way to Treblinka. So he was injured almost as soon as he was at Treblinka. And despite his conspicuous inability to lift his right arm at all, Weinstein survived in this space of resistance until he was able to escape from the camp with the help of others. His survival in the Ferdestall was early in the existence of the camp, long before the establishment of the official infirmary at the suggestion of Galevsky. That timing makes me think that the creation of infirmary as a place of healing was never Galevsky's intent. Prisoners already had a place to recover in the Ferdestall. That was already working for them. The infirmary in the Ferdestall took on positions as a space of resistance through inmates' ability to control their uses and meanings. At this space, women helped remove informants and carried information to the Ferdestall that could have warned of impending visits by the guards or other changes during the daytime hours. While some work on the camp already pointed out Dr. Levkovsky and her assistance in resistance at the barracks infirmary, Bronka Sukno's ability to act as a courier between the Ferdestall and the prisoner workshops on the other side of the camp has not really been recognized. Kleinman's early 1944 memoir further confirms that she and other women working in the tailor's shop could enter the SS barracks at will to collect or drop off clothing. The importance of their ability to watch that space and report on the comings and goings of the guards could hardly be overstated. It really just gives the prisoners the ability to keep track of the guards. Beyond the Ferdestall and the infirmary space, the contributions of women are more directly stated in sources covering the provision and concealment of arms for the uprising. Turning now to the camp kitchen as the next space of resistance I want to cover, brings us back to the day of the revolt and plans for distributing arms stolen from the German armory on the day of the fighting. Examination of this space further compels that we confront the erasure of women from both the history of Treblinka and the planning of resistance in male survivor testimony. In his interview, Abraham Kolsky stated that he was to collect a weapon from the camp kitchen a couple hours before the revolt. He explains that arms intended for his work detail were stored there after other prisoners had stolen them from the SS armory with the use of a secretly acquired key. What Kolsky doesn't say at that or any other time in the interview is that Jewish women staffed the kitchen, which was located here at the front of the prisoner barracks building in A, B, and C, this area. In fact, Mr. Kolsky never mentions women prisoners in his oral history at all. Other sources, however, confirm that the work details in the kitchen, laundry, and tailor shop in the main section of the camp were either entirely or partly made up of Jewish women. During his interview, Sam Goldberg told of how he supervised between 24 and 33 women in the laundry facilities at Treblinka, one each for German, Travniki, and Jewish clothing, which was not supposed to mix under any circumstance. Sonia Levkovich worked in the German laundry. Each was quite near or inside the barracks, with laundry for the German SS joining the kitchen. So that's right there in the same area. Bronka Sukno's tailor's shop was in the same building with both of those work areas. In total, as many as 40 Jewish women worked in this section of the camp, with a further 13 to 20 working or housed near the gas chambers and burial pits. And we come back to that group in just a little bit. Abraham Kolsky, though, is not alone in his silence on the daily lives and contributions of women prisoners. Unlike Mr. Eisner's interview, however, he doesn't deny the existence of women in Treblinka. He just never brings them up, and he's not asked. His fellow survivor, Abraham Bomba's interview with the VHA is more like that of Eisner. I'd like to play a small clip from Bomba's interview now. Please note that by my camp, when he says the phrase my camp, he's talking about the specific section of Treblinka that he was assigned to.
Were there any women as signed in your camp?
In my camp, there was no woman. There was 2 women, which I found out about it. They're over there, they're working over there. After the war, I knew one of them, Sonia. I knew her very well. I met her. We were together in Israel. A lovely woman. But beside those 2 women, I don't know any other woman was there. It could be, but I don't know.
Did you know who the commandant of the camp was?
Now, Bomba's statement, I think, is remarkable for a few reasons. First, because he's not correct about there not being any women there. And whether he blocked that out or blocked out that truth by the time he gave that interview, he must have known that they were there while he was in the camp. Mr. Bomba escaped Treblinka prior to the revolt, though not until he had endured months inside Treblinka. Some of you may recognize him from the difficult and emotional interviews he gave to Claude Lanzmann for the documentary Shoah. In those, Bomba recalled his forced labor as a barber cutting the hair of women sent to their deaths in the gas chambers at Treblinka. He and other men who evade or discount the existence of women prisoners never deny that the Nazis murdered thousands of women at the camp. They just won't talk about the more personal fates of women who lived in the camp as fellow prisoners. Kolsky too recounts acts of resistance by women who arrived, including a woman who killed one man and wounded another with a razor blade as she got off the train, all the while saying he knows nothing about women prisoners. Other testimonies and attention to the camp geography, though, can help us arrive at conclusions despite the contradictions of witnesses like Bomba, Eisner, and Kolsky. Treblinka survivor Jonas Kornhändler's VHA interview provides a starting point. Kornhändler arrived at Treblinka from Częstochowa, Poland in September 1943. Bomba was also in the Częstochowa ghetto and was deported to Treblinka about the same time. Neither is exact about the date, so they may even arrived on the same day. When Mr. Kornhändler differs from Mr. Bomba, though, is in his frankness about the existence of women prisoners in Treblinka. He not only says that they worked in the kitchen, he also states that you could see them from the kitchen, see the kitchen from the barracks he slept in. This would have been the same barracks as Bomba, and you can see how close. This is the sleeping area, and those are those kitchens, and there were windows here, so you could see right over to those areas from the living areas of the Jewish male prisoners. I've got a clip as well from Mr. Kornhändler's VHA interview that I'd like to share now.
What other buildings were in the camp that you remember?
There was a building, a kitchen, a special, where they cooked for the Nazi, Jewish girls, you know, cooking for the Nazi, across from our barracks. There was a big kitchen there.
So Kornhändler slept in the same barracks as Bomba, from which he says you could see this kitchen and the women who worked there. And Kornhändler also possessed like the same access to space within the camp. He could go to the same places as Bomba. It's almost impossible to believe that Eisner, Kolsky, and Bomba did not see or likely even speak to these women. Beyond Kornhändler's statement that you could see their workplace from the barracks, the fact that Jewish women prisoners slept in a partitioned area of the same building in which men were housed is also well documented. And that's this little letter G way back here in the corner of the barracks building. That's the women's area of the barracks. The woman Bomba names in his interview, Sonia Levkovich, actually wasn't transferred to the other side of the camp until after Bomba had escaped. So at the time he, Eisner, Kolsky, and Kornhändler were in Treblinka, Sonia Levkovich and Bronka Sukno were 2 of the very women that Bomba says he never saw. I would be surprised if where she worked did not come up when they met in post-war life. The family of Sam Goldberg, the laundry supervisor that I've talked about, has given me a DVD of a year 2000 prisoner meeting with both Sonia Levkovich and Bronka Sukno attending, along with 4 male survivors and other family members. At that gathering, all the survivors talked to the camp and what they went through there and like where they worked and where they lived. And I feel confident that Mr. Bomba's earlier meetings with Sonia Levkovich would have probably gone the same way. Meeting women survivors in Israel, though, did not change Bomba's recollections of women's work details in the camp. What he says in the interview shows that making the acquaintance of Sukno and Levkovich only led him to state that there were 2 women in the camp. He didn't want to go any further than that. He did not add context for their lives, discuss their larger work details, or comment on what they were doing inside Treblinka. Contemporary witnesses, though, are not the only individuals to kind of remove women from the history of Treblinka and resistance there. But in order to explain the role of historians in that silence, I got to step back for a second and speak a little bit about Treblinka geography. So designers of the Treblinka II extermination camp, as well as Belzec and Sobibor, divided those facilities into strictly separated parts. At Treblinka, they're often called Camp 1 and Camp 2. Camp 1 is everything below this line. So the things called living camp and reception camp are often called Camp 1. Camp 2 is the death camp area up here, where the gas chambers and the burial pits and the later pyres for burning the bodies were all located. Each camp inside Treblinka II had its own Jewish prisoner population. Treblinka's SS and Travniki guards ensured that any prisoner who entered Camp 2 never went back to Camp 1 alive. That segregation was for the purposes of secrecy, and it was brutally enforced despite the realities of Camp 2 really being common knowledge to all held in any part of Treblinka, and increasingly common knowledge to anyone throughout Poland. Up to this point in the talk, we've really only discussed spaces and prisoners held in Camp 1. My final space of resistance was in Camp 2, inside the prisoner barracks building there. So in his 1987 book, The Operation Reinhard Death Camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, that's the black covered book there, and its 2018 updated edition, Yitzhak Arad titles a 5-page chapter, Women Prisoners. In that, he quotes Camp 2 survivor Eliyahu Rosenberg on the formation of a women's work detail in the death camp portion of Treblinka in February of 1943. And Rosenberg says, quote, "At the time, 13 girls were brought to the camp, 6 employed in the laundry, 3 in the kitchen, 1 by the camp doctor as an aide, and the others were allotted to the various capos." Arad stops the quote there with an ellipsis. Please note also the punctuation that he uses or doesn't use. It'll be important to what we compare it to. When I had the opportunity to spend several months in Israel researching at Yad Vashem, I was able to see Rosenberg's original writing. The quote here and that used by Arad are from the same Rosenberg written testimony provided to prosecutors in Vienna in 1947. Translation from the German here is my own. And Rosenberg says, quote, "At this time, 13 women were brought to the camp, of whom 6 were assigned to the laundry, 3 to the kitchen, where until then only a boy had worked. 1 was taken to the camp doctor as his, in quotation marks, assistant, and 3 others were assigned to the various capos, in quotation marks again, for their private use. Beyond these 3 capos specifically, the Germans allowed every capo to visit these women between 6 and 10 p.m. in the evenings." As you can see, quite unfortunately, the original quote carries far greater implications than that used by Arad. I believe also that the omission of the quotation marks around aid and assistant really changes the meaning of what Rosenberg was actually saying. Those are scare quotes in the original. He's saying that that's not really what they were. Rosenberg also uses those scare quotes around the term private use to tell us that private use means something more in the section cut off by Arad. And I think if we really want to delve deeply into what's going on, this is 13 nashim. Nashim is the Hebrew word for women. Yitzhak Arad was the director of Yad Vashem, so he had personal access to these documents. I think that's actually Yitzhak Arad's own handwriting in the margins of this document. But Yitzhak Arad didn't want to go further and say what had happened to these women. He was definitely pointing at something more, though. Rosenberg's statement alongside the 1961 Eichmann trial testimony of Camp 2 survivor Shlomo Hellman reveals the existence of a site of forced sexual exploitation, or what's often termed a brothel, in works on other German camps during the Holocaust. While oral histories and existing Treblinka literature don't mention such a place, these early written testimonies prove its presence. Hellman further describes how women forced to endure this place provided the lion's share of guns available to Camp 2 prisoners on the day of the revolt. Explaining the day of the uprising, he stated, quote, "Our girls, meanwhile, distracted the Ukrainians who had put down their rifles back in the waiting room." He then states that Moshe Schneider ran into this waiting room and attempted to flee with 8 rifles secured by these women. He was shot, but the weapons seem to have ended up in the hands of other Jewish prisoners. This quote unquote waiting room does not appear on any map of Treblinka, and you can imagine why it wouldn't. But a women's barracks room, a capo's room, and a doctor's room all adjoin in the same section of the building. And that is right here, these 3 narrow rooms, B, C, and D. E might be this very waiting room. Shlomo Hellman also recounts how Zello Bloch ambushed and overpowered a Travniki guard near the well. That well is right out here. And threw that guard down the well and took his rifle on the day of the revolt. But before finding Hellman's testimony, this was the only known source of a weapon for Camp 2 prisoners. The amount of testimonies that talk of firing back at the guards in this section of the camp has always seemed too high for the 1 or 2 rifles seized at the well. Hellman and Rosenberg's combined revelation of sexual exploitation at Treblinka not only returns long ignored women to the historical record, it also shows their pivotal participation in the revolt. There was a camp brothel at Treblinka, and on August 2nd, 1943, it became a space of resistance for the theft of arms. It is also unfortunate that survivors and historians have avoided revealing the existence of this place, and it is long delayed acknowledgement of what these women endured and the role they played in the capture of arms for the uprising. Arad's decision to stop short of quoting Rosenberg in ways that would clearly reference sexual exploitation seems in keeping with the time at which he wrote. His book also barely mentions that Sukno and Rosenberg insist Treblinka's deputy commandant was gay and maintained a forced Jewish sexual partner in the camp. Discussions of sex, sexuality, sexual exploitation, rape, gender, masculinity, and related topics began to appear regularly in studies of the Holocaust only many years later. Arad might have also feared that continuing Rosenberg's quote would harm living survivors. Recall the unnamed woman who worried that her husband and family might discover what she had gone through and judge her for it if she testified against guards. In an extensive exploration of those topics while many survivors were still alive may have made her fears a reality. I believe the same sort of logic, among other factors, is at play in the silences and erasures of those later oral history interviews given by the male survivors. Few oral history interviews given by men who survived Treblinka mention sex, sexual violence, or the lives of women inside the camp. That tendency to avoid the topic in recorded interviews at times runs contrary to the recollections of men in other formats. That's particularly true for statements written in the years just after the war. Eddie Weinstein, the survivor who was shot in the arm and hidden in the Ferdestall from earlier in this talk, he says nothing of women at Treblinka in his oral history, but in his memoir written in 1947 and published in 2008, Weinstein said much more. He states, quote, "We also heard that the Germans spared pretty women, whom they kept around for gang rape by German officers and Ukrainians, and murdered them. Only men were employed in the parts of Treblinka where I worked. Once someone called my attention to a young woman dressed as a teenage boy who was sorting clothes among us. I don't know how long she survived." So in that passage, Weinstein, as others, is more forthcoming about the fate of women that circumstances did not force him to consider personally. Here again, the male survivor recalls what happened to anonymous women who were raped and murdered at the hands of the Nazis, albeit after the distancing words, quote unquote, "we also heard," without ever becoming long-term prisoners of the camp. Weinstein here follows the example of Bomba, Kolsky, and Eisner in denying the presence of women we can prove he saw by examining the geography of his life in the camp. He lived in the same area as Bomba and must have been fed at the same kitchen as the other Camp 1 prisoners. Commensurately, the selections, unfortunately, rapes and murders that he says he heard about and insinuates he did not actually see took place in areas he would have been able to routinely view from where he was in the camp. The most important difference between his interview and that of the others mentioned here, though, is that the interviewer never directly asked him about the presence of women, so he was never put in the position to make a denial. What must be addressed first is that male survivors may have their own troubling reasons to avoid discussion of women in the camp. Now, to be certain, the male survivors mentioned in this talk today, weighing their oral histories, other sources they've left behind, and what I can conclude about their lives from further evidence, they don't appear to have any individual culpability in the sexual victimization of Jewish women at Treblinka. This is not to say that acts of sexual violence or relationships of a tremendously unequal and exploitative nature did not take place between Jews in this camp or during the Holocaust writ large. Our sources show that Jewish men and women did enter into relationships that can be called sex's barter or instrumental sex in the terms of historians Anna Haikova and Waitman Born. Rather, for the interviewees highlighted today, I believe that their silences in the oral history format specifically are particular to that process, and something historians using those sources should bear in mind more generally. The existence of these and other oral histories that avoid the topics of women prisoners and sex and sexual violence make us consider what might cause interviewees to be evasive. And I believe that their silences are best described by what the historian Mary Louise Roberts terms gender damage, or injury to their masculine self-conception brought on for those survivors by the discussion of violence against women. Those men, who are also victims of the Holocaust themselves, could do little or nothing to protect Jewish women from the sexual violence of guards and some prisoners in positions of power. The prospect of telling such stories years later might be understood as a traumatic bridge too far. In short, retelling the full picture of sexual violence against women at Treblinka could cause a revisitation of their inability to protect women as their traditional gender roles required. It's also necessary to consider the audience and settings specific to the oral history process. In the vast majority of cases, men who survived Treblinka and gave oral history interviews recorded their contributions in their own homes. Interviewees for the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, interviewers that is for the Shoah Foundation, did their best to make sure these survivors were recorded in private, and that means away from the presence of their family members with just the interviewer and the videographer present. Though several interviews show that this wasn't always possible. Archival interview notes for Treblinka revolt survivor Leon Diskin's oral history, for example, contain a remark by the interviewer that you can see here that states, "Survivor's wife arrives unexpectedly and fuddles in the kitchen. Even the best laid plans can go awry." Those best laid plans were the hope that Mr. Diskin could be recorded alone. Similarly, Family members and other individuals can clearly be heard moving around in the background of a lot of other interviews. Samuel Goldberg's Yiddish language VHA interview includes the voice of his wife, Esther, calling out to him on a couple of few occasions. It's actually something of a comic relief at times when you're listening to something this bad. She shouts out to him, asking if he wants a coffee. At least breaks up what you're listening to a couple of times. Escaped survivor Adek Stein's VHA oral history interview, though, best demonstrates the relevance of audience and interviewer-interviewee interactions. And I'm going to play this last clip for you and ask you to observe both what Mr. Stein says and his body language. The body language is equally important for discussing the topic of sexual violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust.
So take some girls. So take some girls to make fun, for fun. Take it out on the street, not on the street, on the part where you've been. I don't want to say this it's too drastic to say what I do. The young girls are here.
In front of you.
You know, this girl, I mean, this girl's here.
Don't worry about this.
I believe Mr. Stein's interview pretty powerfully shows the difficulty many older traditional men had with the prospect of discussing sex and sexual violence in front of family and or women more generally. While he means it's quote unquote what he means is too drastic to tell his stories in front of young women to protect them from injury and hearing this history. It's also clear that he's protecting himself from the pain of reliving those events in the company of people who remind him of the victims he had no power to protect. I've had the opportunity to work through 95 oral histories tagged as Treblinka survivors, and of those, 4 are women survivors, though none were held in the camp long enough to comment on daily life, resistance, or revolt. It's unfortunate that Branka Sukno and Sonia Levkovich did not give interviews. Returning to the interviews given by men, 75% of them were interviewed by women. And of those men who endured a camp at a time in the camp longer than one day, 89% were interviewed by women. Statistics on how many of those interviews were conducted near or in the direct presence of family members is not possible to calculate. The percentage of male Treblinka survivors interviewed by women is actually a bit higher than the statistics for the overall Holocaust survivor interviews in the Shoah Foundation VHA. So of the 53,000 Holocaust oral histories for which an interviewee's sex is recorded, 68% of all interviewers are women, while 67% of male survivors and 73% of female survivors were interviewed by women. I compiled those statistics with the reluctant witnessing of Adek Stein fresh in my mind. Though I don't believe the avoidances, silences, or distractions of the oral histories of some male survivors can be attributed exclusively to the sex of the interviewer, I see that as a factor that we have to consider moving forward. My research shows multiple cases of male interviewees that are much more forthcoming in other formats, from Eddie Weinstein's book that mentions sexual violence while his oral history doesn't, to the inaccuracies and inconsistencies of several other men cited here. I take that as like a cautionary tale to bear in mind when viewing these valuable sources. Though my own project always forces me to attempt the reconstruction of women's lives through the voices of men, I'm equally curious what others might find regarding oral history recollections of women survivors. The history of resistance at Treblinka and its memory in multiple ways are impacted by gendered thinking. Inside the camp, women's work details and spatial access of women like Branka Sukno reflected the gender beliefs of German guards, often to the benefit of resistance. They simply didn't see women as much of a threat as Jewish men. The SS thereby got themselves into more trouble in that way. As Sukno states, she had the ability to enter the normally forbidden personal quarters of the SS on the basis of her sex. Moishe Kleinman, a male tailor, did not enter the SS quarters. Of course, the violent sexual exploitation that other women endured in Camp 2 brothel is the most terrible example of this same thinking. Though women here transform this space into a powerful source of material support for the resistance, I can think of no other place where guards would set down rifles in the presence of Jews. The sexual violence they perpetrated and their beliefs about women's supposed inability to threaten their power undoubtedly played a role in the laxity of their actions and the ability of others to rise up against them. Our knowledge of these events and others inside Treblinka during the Holocaust more broadly is the product of gendered thinking at the time and in the years following. As Yaakov Eisner's interview shows us, women had more, or at least very different, things to fear in coming forward as trial witnesses and later oral history subjects. I think it no coincidence that Bronka Sukno and Sonia Levkovich sought the community of their fellow survivors, as we could see in that video that I was given by family members, though they never wrote memoirs or, to my knowledge, recorded interviews for public consumption. Nevertheless, I find that attention to the networks and spaces of resistance at Treblinka allows us to read against the surface level distortions and evasions of male testimony to recover the contributions of women in resistance. Jewish women at Treblinka fought back in self-led, spontaneous moments of armed and unarmed resistance, and they organized to protect their own lives and those of others at great peril. And they endured the eye of hell to arm an insurrection they knew it was unlikely they would survive themselves. And thanks. I look forward to your questions.
So I have one question for you from online.
Okay.
What impact does trauma have on survivor accounts, and how do historians navigate the effects of trauma on memory?
Yeah, that is a great question. Trauma is has an enormous and kind of hard to quantify impact on memory. It could cause someone to forget whole instances, as we know. It can cause blocked memories. It can cause very delayed accounting of what someone will tell. That's what I think is going on here. There are some traumas that these men perhaps are seeing that are either being inflicted upon women or other related things, and they're kind of blocking things out. So this is exactly that trauma bearing on memory. Trauma bearing on memory with the added layer of this being gender-based trauma. So I think that question pretty much really pushes toward what the main point of the talk is. Yeah.
Amber, if you want to take one from in person, or do you want me to keep going from online?
All right, we got one question. I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Biblet.
Okay. Well, we hope so. There was a brief mention in the presentation of male prisoners also being occasionally seen as sexual victims of guards too.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, do we have any reports of any of the camps, the people who are interviewed here, discussing that, or noticeably not discussing that in any detail at all? Because if that's the case, then we have to conclude it wasn't just about the issue of protecting women, but just simply not wanting to be either to think about or embarrass other men or women and having been forced to be in those roles. That's what I wonder.
Yeah, good question. Thank you for it. So the oral history interviewees, again, through that process of trying to figure out where they were in the camp and being able to tell by a system of rules, their job, where they lived, it doesn't appear that the voices that literally survived long enough to give an oral history interview would have seen the semi-documented case that we know of, at least, of sexual violence against a male prisoner. That's not to say that maybe they saw something else and they're also not speaking of that. So it remains a kind of an open question as well. The way that prisoner survivors have dealt with the issue of sexual violence against men is even another layer, really, and it goes as well with historians, because the name of the prisoner who was most likely the forced partner of this guard is recorded in the sources, and people have to this day refused to bring that name into their texts, and I've also not done that. I'm not really sure about if that will stay that way as my manuscript moves forward. I've been in conversation with people about whether or not to name individuals when it comes to sexual violence, whether it be men and women or men and men. It's just another layer that Yitzhak Arad also had that name, didn't use it, and didn't use some of the sources that he had that brought up that issue. I feel like I also rambled there, so if I didn't fully answer your question, please give me another shot at it.
Do you have more in the queue, Molly?
Yeah, I have a student question. The student would like to know if Treblinka was the only camp that had a specific brothel area.
It wasn't. And in fact, we'll probably never know how many camps had one. They were more or less official, depending upon the camp that you're speaking about. At Auschwitz, there was a very official and regulated camp brothel to which powerful or influential or prisoners that the guards were seeking to make more pliable were given basically what you could call passes to visit the brothel. It was part of the incentive and reward system for certain more or less collaborationist prisoners. So that is like the one extreme, this very official brothel at Auschwitz, versus the kind of not discussed, covered up, euphemized brothel that existed at Treblinka. And I think that we could just say that there's a whole spectrum in between. One of the questions I normally get giving this talk or something like it is, did the German SS use this brothel? Because the German SS were bound by Nazi Germany's race shame laws, and we've long kind of accidentally believed Nazi propaganda that Nazi Germans do not have sex with Jews because this is race shame, this is against the rules, and they did not cross that line. It seems that this brothel was probably open for the use of capos, like ranking prisoners, and what was called the Travniki guards, the non-German guards. But the Germans themselves were committing sexual violence of a different form that's not covered by this talk in a different part of the camp, also against Jewish women. So they did cross that line. It's just something that I didn't want to throw into this Q&A as we're talking about it, but it seems that the Germans didn't use this place themselves.
Another student asks about any records that exist about sexual violence against women from other prisoners.
So it is that what I'm trying to get at in the talk, it's a little easier to get in a longer form like the manuscript, is that the sources that we have on sexual violence against women are almost entirely from survivors. They're just more likely the written sources than they are to be oral history sources. The oral histories tend to be less comprehensive when it comes to talking about sex and sexual violence. With my theory being that it's a outcome of basically the recording process and who's in the room and who's comfortable speaking in front of whom. But the early books, sometimes trial records. Now, sometimes survivors really want to talk about sexual violence as part of what they're accusing guards of having done. It's unfortunate for us as people who want to know exactly what took place that the prosecutors were almost never charging rape. And therefore, they were uninterested in those stories, and they would even, and you end up as a historian screaming at a piece of paper because you read the prosecutor say, "Oh, that's not interesting," or "That's not what I'm asking, please move on." And you're shaking a piece of paper angrily, wanting to know this piece that they've left out of history, that the one time someone may have told that story.
I have a student question here as well, so I'm going to hand the mic over for that.
You mentioned that the women that were kept for private use in the capitals, that they were available from 6 to 10 p.m. Do you know what their life would have looked like outside of those 4 hours?
Yeah, I think that outside of those 4 hours, they were probably engaged in more everyday forms of work, like the laundry that was kept in that side of the camp and the kitchen of that side of the camp, very gender-coded professions or tasks. So when not in those hours, or exploitation that may have taken place outside of those hours, there was still those other tasks in that same area, the laundry and the kitchen. And I get there, I'm sorry, I should say, I get there by basically counting up. When other testimonies are telling me about how many women did what, you realize that there aren't enough women to have done all of these jobs, so clearly done all these jobs or terrible places of exploitation. So you can see that some people are doing more than one thing. They're crossing those lines.
This is a problem. Holly, do you have any more questions on your end?
I do not.
All right. What else? Do we have any more in here? All right. We have one last question coming from the room.
Hi, Chad. I'm Kevin Amidon. I'm a journalist, and I've taught some Holocaust studies, though it's not my core specialty. I'm really intrigued by these micro-historical methods, the way you've been able to get to these extraordinarily detailed readings of what we long thought were going to be unavailable to us. Do you have any plans to expand your exploration, perhaps with these kinds of methods, to other Holocaust sites? Because, of course, what always comes to mind, the minute anyone says Holocaust resistance, is the old Dan Diner thesis, for example, about the Lodz ghetto, that overly simply put, less resistance meant more survival, which is, of course, oversimplified, but there are a lot of survivors from Lodz, and whether a kind of comparative approach with the kinds of methods you're, I think, fair to say, pioneering here would be really interesting.
And thanks for the question. I do like that idea, and I don't know what direction the second project will take yet, but the Czestochowa ghetto seems to be, it seems to me, and I could just be missing the literature on it, but it seems to be understudied in general. And there was resistance planning that went on there. And it seems to be a place that could fall under one of my mentors' ideas of find a place small enough and read everything on it, that I could kind of turn this methodology toward the Czestochowa ghetto, for all intents and purposes, slightly larger place, and see if it also applies to that resistance there. There were about 40,000 Jews that were sent from Częstochowa to Treblinka. So in the process of doing years of work on Treblinka, I've inadvertently learned a lot about the Częstochowa ghetto and the people that were in it. And a lot of them end up, they are in resistance. They are, I kind of reject the idea of resistance personality more for in exchange for a resistance situationality, a situation that gives you the opportunity to resist, the ability to know that it's time to resist. And once you've done it once, you're looking for that opportunity again. So it's a matter of like opportunity and knowledge and a history of having been looking for that opportunity. But a lot of people who decide to resist at Treblinka, their first decision to resist took place in a spot like the Częstochowa ghetto. So like Samuel Willenberg survives arriving at Treblinka because somebody whose life he saved in Częstochowa recognizes him and pulls him out of the line to the gas chamber. So not only are there like other places I'd like to kind of deploy this methodology, if you will, but I think that they're deeply connected to who ends up in resistance at which place. They feed into each other. And I'd kind of, if things go in that direction, it would be one place I'd like to be a second project on something like that.
All right, so I think if we don't have any more questions, let's offer a final thanks to Dr. Gibbs for taking the time to talk to us today. And of course, we will be in contact in the future. For those of you who are attending, we do have several events scheduled throughout the month. We have another talk with Dr. Lovro Krall, who will be talking about the Ustasha movement in Croatia and collaboration there. That is going to happen on April 19th at 3:30 p.m., same place. And then we also have a book club to talk about Lucy Adelton's The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, which I think dovetails really well with Dr. Gibbs' talk today. You even talked about Taylor's a little bit, so I'll be excited to see how people who attend both events draw those things together. And then finally, we will be showing Everything is Illuminated, which talks about Ukrainian Holocaust memory at the Hays Public Library on April 21st. So please do attend some or all of those events, whatever works for you. And again, thank you for taking the time to come out today.
Hey, Amber, just real quickly, you said that Lovro's talk was at 3:30. It's at 3.
Oh, 3. Yes, Lovro's talk is at 3. Thank you.
Thank you all.